Good morning and welcome. My name is Susie Brown and I'm the president of the Minnesota Council on Foundations, and on behalf of Minnesota's philanthropic community, I welcome you here to the Twin Cities and to the great state of Minnesota, and we thank you for being here with us today. We have a great number of our excellent members in the room here with you today on this learning journey for the next couple days. So I encourage you to meet folks from Minnesota and look to them for their experience in the field, but also nuts and bolts things like where's the closest Target, what's the best coffee shop. They can help you out. For those who are able, people who represent Minnesota foundations, could you stand and your colleagues here can see who you are? These are the folks we hope you get to know over the next couple of days. I'd like to take a moment to give a particular note of thanks to the Minnesota foundations whose sponsorship support of this event helped make this possible. Those include the Marguerite Cargill Foundation, the McKnight Foundation, the Bush Foundation, the General Mills Foundation, the Carlson Family Foundation, the GHR Foundation, and the Northwest Area Foundation. Please join me in thanking those Minnesota-based sponsors for this conference. I also want to take a moment to thank the CEP staff for putting on a great conference. This is my first time at this conference, and I'm really impressed with the incredible speakers and content that we have to look forward to. Particular tip of the hat to a person I haven't met, Ethan McCoy. Is he here? Ethan provides the daily wrap-up or roundup or whatever, so you probably have an email in your inbox from Ethan, and if you missed last night's incredible program, you can see some highlights from that thanks to Ethan's work. And finally, I'd like to thank the staff and servers of the Hilton for the great service that they're providing for us so we're comfortable here today. So I'm just going to take a moment to contemplate with you, why do we come together as a field of philanthropy? And here, for the next couple of days, we're doing so in order to help us become more effective as individual foundations and also to strengthen our field of philanthropy. So we have a great learning journey together for the next couple days, thanks to CEP. At the organization where I work, the Minnesota Council on Foundations, we came together 50 years ago. We're approaching our 50th anniversary, so it's a time of contemplation about what brought us together then and really what we're doing together now. So I have our history in this little book, and I'm just going to read to you the 6 objectives that were identified 50 years ago for why philanthropic organizations in Minnesota decided to come together. And they really resonate today. I also recently turned 50 and I haven't been to the eye doctor yet, so this is ridiculous. Bear with me. So objective number 1 was to encourage a climate that would maintain the vigor of private foundations. Objective number 2 is to provide the public and foundations with annual information on the foundation's financial and programmatic activities. Objective number 3, to make Minnesota foundations more aware of proposed state and federal legislation affecting them. Objective number 4, to help Minnesota foundations identify society's critical needs through reports, conferences, and seminars for foundation trustees and staff. Objective number 5, to inform foundations of sound administrative and management practices. And objective number 6, to provide an occasional forum for exploring with donee organizations their observations, progress, and needs. What do you think? Have we dispensed with all those, or are those still at the forefront? I think we might say them a little bit differently, and maybe just in little sound bites I'll go through. This is how I see them today. Objective number 1, we want a strong philanthropic sector. Strengthening philanthropy. That's what we're doing here. Objective number 2, transparency is important. Objective number 3, we want to be at the table when lawmakers are talking about us and our work. Objective number 4, this is what I wrote. We want to be aware of what's happening in the society around us and responsive. Objective number 5, we need to run our organizations well and effective. Number 6, we want to be in a relationship with the grantee community so we can learn from them. So 50 years ago, the foundations in Minnesota, many of whom are here today, that were the founders of the Minnesota Council on Foundations, set us on a path which is not that different from today, except, as we learned last night, the context is so different today. And that's why I'm excited about the content of this conference. I hope you've all had a chance to look through this booklet. The things that we have before us are going to set these objectives into today's context. We learned some things last night that were so important for us to chew on. I hope most of you were able to come last night. Otherwise, look at Ethan's email. We learned from Grant Oliphant that we have really a critical question today to think about who holds power in leadership and what does that mean. Also, we learned from him that we are in a moment of critique in our sector. People are criticizing us and we have to figure out what to do about that. Professor Sandals, what a great evening. He really led us in important exercises and helped us understand 2 important issues. One is that the discourse today is so divisive. We know that, but these objectives 50 years ago were set in a time when the discourse was more productive and more collaborative. And it's divisive and unproductive today. And also, to his main point, we're becoming a market society where the idea of monetizing everything is acceptable, and we have to really ask ourselves the hard questions about whether that makes sense and what's the impact of that. He ended last night with a metaphor that I like very much, which is that what we're doing here is exercising our muscle, that the work that we do is not something to be depleted, but it's a muscle to be exercised. So I'm delighted to be here with all of you and with all of my colleagues from the Minnesota philanthropic community to learn together on this journey about the context in which we achieve our objectives, we can be effective organizations and a stronger philanthropic community, and let's exercise those muscles together. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, good morning. Thank you, Susie, and thanks to the Minnesota Council on Foundations for being a great partner. I haven't had a chance to say welcome to everyone yet, so I'm going to do that right now. Welcome to everyone. I'm Phil. I work at CEP. We have a great day today planned, and just because I don't know if I'm going to be able to do this or when it might happen, and I don't want to forget, I want to acknowledge the staff of CEP and just have everybody on the staff stand for just a sec. One of the best things about my life is to work with this group of people. I want to give special acknowledgement to Grace and Ying, Grace Nicolette and Ying Tao, for all of their work on the conference, and also the rest of the program and external relations team, including Jay, Ethan, who you just heard about, but also Sarah Martin, who I think was the co-author of the daily update, as well as our colleague Valerie. So hope that today we can keep in our mind the conflicting thoughts and paradoxes that Grant so beautifully and eloquently alluded to last night. Here's one for you, that we can really acknowledge the problems in our communities, globally, domestically, in philanthropy, in our society, in ourselves, and also acknowledge where there is progress. The places where there has been success remind us that we can learn from success, that progress does happen, that it is possible, and that we should keep pursuing it. I also need that appointment at the glasses store. Another conflicting thought or set of thoughts that leads into the session that we're going to launch into in a moment. That philanthropy influencing policy can be, as some critics have argued, an undemocratic, top-down exercise of power. And that it can also be, in the words of historian Olivier Zunz, something that enlarges our democracy, that lifts up the most vulnerable, that expands rights, and that strengthens our democracy. And that's what this great panel is going to talk about now. So I'm going to turn it over to my CEP colleagues, Kevin Beaudet and Ellie Buteau, as well as Paul Beaudet of the Wilburforce Foundation and the CEP board, Carmen Rojas, CEO and founder of Workers Lab and board member of the Marguerite Foundation, and Lorie Slutsky, president of the New York Community Trust. Take it away, Kevin.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. As Phil mentioned, I'm Kevin Baldick, Vice President of Assessment and Advisory Services at CEP. And we are really excited to kick off this session this morning talking about this really crucial question of the role of foundations in changing or affecting or commenting on public policy. And so that's where we're going to start. And for years, obviously, this is not new. For years, foundations have looked to engagement with public policy as an incredibly important tool to achieve all of your goals. Foundations often focus, obviously, on systems problems that can require the scale or reach of governments to actually have a durable solution. Public will and laws sometimes need to change to accomplish the goals that you set out for yourselves. And so cautiously, for a long time, foundations have turned to the idea that public policy engagement can be a crucial lever that they can be pulling to help achieve the really important goals that you've all set for yourselves. And yet, we live in this time in which the influence of wealthy elites is increasingly met with skepticism, if not downright opposition. So how are foundations engaging with public policy efforts in this moment? That was the question we faced. And as we often do at CEP, we wanted to bring some data to the conversation. And so we've kicked off a two-part study about how foundations engage in public policy efforts. And to discuss those findings, I'm joined today by four great panelists. My colleague Ellie Buteau, Vice President of Research at CEP. Next to her, Lorie Slutsky, the President of the New York Community Trust, the Community Foundation in New York City. Paul Beaudet, Executive Director of Wilburforce Foundation, and Carmen Rojas, co-founder and CEO of the Workers Lab and board member of the Marguerite Foundation. So I'm going to start by asking Ellie, why did we set out in this research? What did we hope to learn, and what did we hear?
Thanks, Kevin. So earlier this year, we sent surveys to almost 600 foundation CEOs of community foundations and independent foundations in the United States that give at least $5 million annually in grants. We wanted to understand the extent to which foundations are engaging in efforts to influence public policy, how they're doing it, why they're doing it. And in our invitation to complete the survey, we tried to be explicit that we wanted to hear from foundation CEOs of foundations that are engaging in policy efforts, as well as CEOs of foundations that aren't engaging in policy. We wanted to understand broadly what are the attitudes of foundation CEOs toward foundations engaging in this work, as well as decisions they've made at their own foundations. We heard back from 214 foundation leaders, and that represented a 38% response rate, which in our experience is a strong response rate for a survey of foundation CEOs. And I do want to share with you the definition of public policy that we provided in the survey. We did a lot of reading on various websites, the Council on Foundations, Independent Sector, Alliance for Justice, and others. We had a lot of conversations with those who are deeply engaged in policy work to understand what's the best definition we should ask foundation leaders to think about. I'll only share a summary of it with you. There's more detail in the survey. But we defined influencing public policy as encompassing the full range of activities that foundations can legally pursue in their efforts to influence government priorities, laws, and regulations at the local, state, regional, and national levels, and across the legislative, judicial, and administrative branches of government. And we did include more specifics in the survey. I won't get into those with you now. And before I share the findings, I do want to thank the funders that provided project support for this research. They enabled us to do this research when we did and in the time frame we did, so thank you. So what did we learn? We learned that 90% of the foundation leaders responding to this survey said that their foundation engages in efforts to influence public policy. Now, when we first saw that statistic, it seemed high to us. So we believe there's some degree of response bias in who did and didn't respond to this survey. Certainly we did get a few emails from foundation CEOs saying, you know, our foundation doesn't engage in this type of work, so I don't think it's relevant for us to fill this out. And I'm sure there are other reasons behind the response bias as well. But 99% of these foundation leaders said they believe that engaging in public policy is important in order for their foundation to be able to achieve its programmatic goals. And we asked an open-ended question, more specifically, why is your foundation engaging in efforts to influence policy? Got a lot of thoughtful responses, and I'll share a couple. One CEO said, the solutions to society's problems are constrained by the systems they reside within. Therefore, engaging in public policy to transform systems is necessary to realize comprehensive solutions to community needs. Another wrote, while we've been very careful not to step into official quote-unquote lobbying roles, we do provide support for advocacy, education, and issue-based campaigns that often influence political or policy debates. We weren't only interested in whether or not foundations were engaging in efforts to influence policy right now, we're also interested in, had their efforts increased, decreased, not changed over the past few years. And almost 3/4 of the responding foundations told us that they have increased their efforts to influence public policy during the past 3 years. And this was true at all geographic levels. 61% have increased their efforts at the local level, 64% at the state level, half regionally, and 52% nationally. In terms of how they're doing this work, 2/3 say they're supporting grantees' efforts to influence public policy. And the activities that foundations are supporting range from supporting convenings and collaborations within the nonprofit sector, across sectors, to trying to help support the mobilization of grassroots efforts, to providing support for research and policy analysis, and many others. 51% of respondents are engaging in activities outside of their grant-making work. And clearly there's some overlap here, that many foundations who are supporting grantees' efforts are also engaging in efforts outside of grant-making. One statistic that I'll share that's not here on the slide is that 80% of responding foundation leaders told us their foundations engaged in collaborative efforts to influence public policy. This is collaborative efforts with other funders, with philanthropy-serving organizations, and across sectors. So what about support of foundation boards to engage in this work? Well, 45% of foundation leaders told us that their board is completely supportive of the foundation's efforts to engage in efforts to influence policy. 50% said the board's somewhat supportive, and 5% said not supportive at all. When it comes to understanding what is legally permissible for the foundation to do in relation to policy work, 71% of foundation leaders believe they understand very well which activities are legally permissible. However, only 30% of foundation leaders believe that their boards understand very well what's legally permissible. We also asked an open-ended question here to give foundation leaders an opportunity to share with us any remaining questions they have about what's legally permissible or any gray areas. Only 29% of respondents answered that question, so there was no burning question or area of confusion. But 30% of those responding to the question said that they're still somewhat confused about what constitutes lobbying and whether or not they're able to support grantees in efforts to lobby. And this is important because 54% of respondents to this survey said that they include language in their grant agreements to either prohibit or limit the grant funds from being used in lobbying efforts or efforts to influence legislation. How are foundation leaders developing their understanding of what's legally permissible? Many of them are looking to philanthropy serving organizations and legal counsel, both in-house legal counsel and external, and they find these two sources to be very helpful to developing their understanding. The last data point I'll share with you is specific to community foundations. About a third of our respondents were community foundation leaders, and community foundations have an additional stakeholder group to consider. It's their donor base. 30% of community foundation leaders that responded believe that they have gained more donors than they've lost due to their efforts to engage in policy work. 70% believe they've neither gained nor lost donors due to policy work. And the statistic you don't see here is that no community foundation leaders believed they had lost more donors than they gained due to their engagement in public policy. So I'll stop there, Kevin.
Thank you, Ellie. Well, what I'm going to do now is ask a few questions to our panelists. Then actually prepare yourselves. I'm going to ask you to talk at your tables about what your own roles and efforts have been on these particular topics. And then we'll come back to some open Q&A with our panelists. But I'd like now to turn to our panelists and I'll ask each of you to answer this question. What did you find most striking in these findings? And if that relates to the work that you do in your own organization, weave that in as well. So, Lorie, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. I actually come out where Ellie comes out. I found the high percentage of foundations that engage in this work surprising. I would have thought, at least our experience working with fairly sophisticated private foundations in New York is, there are certainly many who will, but I wouldn't say it's 90%. So I just found that surprising. And the second part of your question is, how does that focus our work?
Yeah.
One of the unique things about being a community foundation is that you don't quite have the luxury of private foundations in focusing your grant work. Your grant work is improving the quality of life for those who live in your community. And so one of the things that we can't do is just push things out. The other great thing about being a community foundation is that we are a public charity, so the lobbying line, which you all toe so clearly, is not one we actually legally have to toe. So if you are a public charity, which is what all community foundations are, you can make the H election on your 990 and tell the IRS that you do intend to work on lobbying, and then there are certain limits that are set. And we use that in concert with our private foundation colleagues in collaborative efforts so that the money that we pool goes to work on advocacy, direct service, sort of research, and the grant making that the community foundation does beside that can help focus on the lobbying.
Thank you. I think we're going to come back to that. Paul.
I also was struck by the 90% figure, and that's certainly not what we're hearing from our grantees that work on the issues that we work on. They report that foundations are generally pretty reluctant to step too deeply into the advocacy pool. And I was reflecting on the 54% of funders who prohibit or limit the use of grant dollars for organizations that engage in policy work, and thought that provides a clue as to what we might see happening, that funders may not be fully stepping into all of the ways that are legally permissible for foundations to engage in this work. And I speak as working in a private foundation context, so we are subject to more restrictions than you would be at the community foundation level. So at Wilburforce, we strive to protect wildlife and wildlands in Western North America. So in our context, the lands that we're working on are almost entirely managed by some kind of government entity. It could be federal, state, provincial, tribal, or First Nation. And so if we really want to see rules, regulations, and policies that allow wildlife to thrive in these places, we need to make sure that we're getting those entities to make smarter decisions. We were informed in our work in part by, and some of you here may be familiar with the Alliance for Justice, which publishes a very helpful resource. It's called the Philanthropy Advocacy Playbook, and they describe the full sweep of legally permissible activities that are possible for even private foundations. And I think what I'm saying, and I was going to use a pool metaphor, deep end, shallow end, but I have a couple environmental colleagues here who encourage me to go environmental. So I'm going to talk about trails. So what I think we see happening is there are a lot of funders and grantees at the trailhead as we're trying to climb a policy summit, and we're doing work together. We're doing the public education, we're doing the convening key constituencies, the community organizing, the mobilizing, the media outreach, and the research. Oh, we love research. But as we head further up the trail, we begin to lose some of our funding colleagues. So for example, litigation is a tool that's available to us. And I was very pleased. I was talking to a colleague at the breakfast table who said that his foundation for the first time ever filed an amicus brief in litigation. But even supporting grantees' efforts to litigate, to compel the government to stop a bad thing from happening under the law, or to force the government to do the right thing under the law. We can support grantees to do that, but a lot of funders don't. Also, engaging in agency rulemaking. That's not subject to the same restrictions that lobbying is, and a lot of us hold back from working on executive orders or rulemaking at the agency level. And then you get further up the trail, it gets a little narrower. Our grantees are plowing ahead, but we're not necessarily standing with them when it comes to lobbying and actually working on policy. And there are lots of ways, well, not lots of ways, but there are ways that we can support their lobbying work. General operating support grants. We can make grants, restricted grants to projects that include a lobbying component with a little bit more due diligence. All we have to do is not earmark, we can't earmark our funds for lobbying, but we shouldn't be prohibiting grantees from using funds to do the lobbying work that they need to do. And then the other thing I think a lot of us get concerned about is voter education and voter engagement work. It matters who we elect in terms of the policies that we get, so it's really important that we get quality people, and educating voters, mobilizing voters is legal. We have to operate within certain restraints. It has to be nonpartisan, but we can do it, and often we hold back. So if we're gonna reach the summit, and we're gonna support our grantees along the entire trail, I would encourage all of us to not hold back from any of the legally permissible activities that we're able to do.
Thanks, Paul. Carmen, you see this as a board member of a foundation. You see this working on the ground in your day-to-day work in the organization that you founded and run. What were your reactions to this?
First, thank you for having me. This is really exciting. It's really great to be here. This is my first CEP conference, and there are a bunch of new faces, and I was mentioning how oftentimes philanthropy can feel like a universe that you know until you enter a space like this and you know absolutely nobody here. So I'm very happy to be here on behalf of Marguerite Casey Foundation. The two data points together that struck me was the 90%, but actually coupled with the 70% who feel comfortable or feel like they have enough information to actually advance policy change work within their institution. And what struck me in that gap, one, I think the 90% might be inflated, but two, that 70% of the people doing the thing, that there's a 20% gap of knowledge. And I wonder where that comes from, especially right now, where we're seeing a whole host of issues become more and more partisan in ways that we haven't been in the near future, in the recent past, sorry. And so I'm really curious, like, what needs to happen in the philanthropic community ecosystem to fill that gap. I'm wondering why people actually don't talk to their lawyers more at philanthropic organizations, why that's a barrier. I think that for us at Marguerite Casey Foundation, we've done a couple of really interesting things. One, the vast majority of our grants are general operating support, over 90%. So we really want to support those people on the ground with the greatest proximity to the communities and issues we care about to advance their agenda, and policy change is one of those tools. I think the second thing that we've done both as a board and as the leadership of the organization, is really try to suss out what are partisan issues and what are ideas or values or ideological issues, and actually make a clear distinction, because I think foundations oftentimes blur values. Everybody has a house, everybody has a right to a house, or everybody has a right to a dignified job, and feel like that's a partisan issue that might get into the lobbying question, when really it's like a values proposition that you're putting forth as an organization. As a board at Marguerite Casey, we've really been grappling with making that distinction and being more elegant and sophisticated in making that distinction. So for us, the tools internally at Marguerite Casey have been multi-year general operating support, and then as a board making the split. Separately, we've established a C4 at Marguerite Casey Foundation as another set of tools, as another vehicle through which our grantees who have C4s can establish C4 organizations, so building the infrastructure for community-based organizations, for social change organizations to have their C4, but also allowing them a separate vehicle that we are not a part of to be able to aggregate those resources to advance the type of political change they want to see out in the world.
Thank you. Thank you all. So clearly each of you is deeply engaged in your own organizations in this kind of work. And yet I started off by talking a little bit about the increased scrutiny of foundations and the influence that they play, whether that is influence that is supportive of all people or whether it's protective of donors or the wealthy elite. So I'm curious how you all have grappled in your own organizations with that question. What is our legitimate role to play in this area, and where do we draw the line?
So I think, again, this is mixed, what is it, like I'm a mixed mixed bag. As a grantee, and we're the Workers Lab is a funding intermediary, and I've spent the vast majority of my career in the philanthropic sector. I think the critique is a valid critique. I think we've seen over time what it looks like to have people with access to millions and billions of dollars place their finger on the scale to their own benefit, and that looks differently. In the last 6 months, it looks like having a tax bill that was passed that had no net benefit for working people in this country. It means having a college scandal that included sort of the luminary of social impact investing that's been informing the philanthropic sector as one of the protagonists of that story. And so what I am trying to do as a trustee at Marguerite Casey Foundation is actually shine a light on the critique being valid. I feel like the sector often screams into a glass and we feel like we're loud because we're hearing our own echo, not realizing the net impact we're having on the communities we're meant to serve. At Marguerite Casey Foundation, I hate to say this, but I feel like we're a different kind of private foundation. 90% of our members are people of color or immigrants. We're all from, we are representative of the places where we do our grant making. We have grantees on our board. So we have actually structured the foundation to have a set of internal checks that I think help to not avoid, right? There's always this question of transparency and accountability, which is an important question. We are at Marguerite Casey Foundation in this interesting moment where we're trying to figure out how we shine a light on those places where we may have not been our best and work to doing better.
Fantastic, thank you. Paul, why don't you go next?
Sorry.
Yeah, no, and I would echo, I mean, your approach matters, your intent matters, the values matter, and I do share those concerns if it's not done well. And I'll focus a little bit on approach. You can't impose a policy solution on communities that aren't willing to accept that policy solution. And for us, the ultimate beneficiaries, we can't engage them in the work. We're talking wolves, we're talking bears. They don't vote, they don't write letters to the legislators. So we rely on our grantees and science to be the voice for wildlife. Beyond that, we need to engage the communities that are going to be impacted by the policies that we're promoting. And that takes a long time. It takes trust, it takes relationship building. Our grantees joke about the number of cups of very bad coffee they have to drink over very many years in order to forge solutions that are going to land well within the community. So I would say that that's an important thing. And then on the intent things, none of the policies that we're striving to create around management of these lands are going to in any way enrich the foundation or its portfolio. And I contrast that to philanthropy from people who are trying to reduce rules and regulations to allow for more oil and gas exploration in public lands. Well, clearly they have an economic interest in those kinds of policies, and we don't have that corresponding interest. But even so, we still have to work with the local communities to find a durable solution. Lorie?
So I'll join my colleagues. Yes, it's a concern. I think it's a valid criticism. I'm not convinced it's a new criticism, or a new problem, but I am convinced it is valid. And the work of a community foundation, I always tell people we're proudly parochial. That actually makes New York's a big city, so it's a big petri dish, but it allows us to focus, and much of our grant work is supporting diverse voices and diverse points of view and making sure all voices get heard, because that's the only way you defend against large philanthropic dollars trying to influence. I mean, if you look at the recent experiment or the recent policy debate in New York over Amazon, it was the voice of a very few who organized the resistance to a policy that had been approved by the governor and the mayor. Now, however you feel about that deal, the idea that small voices from around the city could rise up and stop that shows that you can, in fact, change that dynamic.
Let me push on this issue of voice a little bit. We're in a moment in which public debate can be swayed quickly and radically by a few voices. You've just given us a great example. I think we've all seen examples on the national stage. I'm curious how you think about the use of your own voice and the legitimacy of your own voice in these really tough questions about how to proceed on a public policy stage. Carmen?
Yeah, I think it's a really important signal or signifier that I'm here and that Luce isn't here, right? Luce, as the leader of Marguerite Casey, has been really, for me, transformative in her commitment to leading from behind, and she's leading behind the communities she is the steward of resources for. And so for us as a foundation, I feel like it's been our job to amplify what's happening on the ground, and we're frankly struggling, right? Because there is a lot of investment by philanthropic organizations to update their brand, to become a part of a social media network, to send out a newsletter, to be engaged in the public debate. When in reality, if we at Marguerite Casey are doing our best job, we are a foundation on top of which our grant recipients get to amplify their visions, their values, their voices and impact. So I feel like this is, I hate to be pithy, but I feel like we're different in that way. And the moment is calling on us. It's clear that we're in a political and an economic moment where there's a more vocal or visible critique of philanthropy. And I wonder whether or not we shouldn't engage more directly in that debate as a different type of philanthropic organization.
Fantastic. Paul?
I would say, generally speaking, we prefer that our grantees exercise their voices because they're going to be more credible spokespeople in the communities in which they're working. There's not much we can add as a Seattle-based foundation to the work that's going on in Idaho or Montana. So the grantees and the people with whom they have relationships are going to be the more powerful voices on the specific proposals that are happening in their communities. But as a foundation, we can lift up the broader message of connectivity and engagement in democracy. For example, last year, we stepped into the more voter education, civic engagement work. We encouraged our funding colleagues and our grantees to just deliver a nonpartisan get out the vote message. It was a learning experience for me, and I think it was something that you hinted at, that even a message as simple as give a voice to the wild, or if you care about the environment, vote, is now deemed risky because it seems like every issue is being sliced into a partisan camp. But the broader message of get out, vote, participate, we feel pretty confident that if more people voted, we'd get more environmentally sound policies because the polling suggests that 80% of people care about conservation and care about their lands. But that doesn't always translate to policy, and it's because we're not always seeing the people who do care coming out and voting for the right candidates. So we'll lift up democracy, we'll lift up some of the broader messages about building capacity, building relationships, but we'll leave it to our grantees to talk about the specific proposals.
Lorie, anything you'd like to add?
I would say we're similar. I once had a colleague call me and say that it's a big funder in New York, and he said, is excited to tell me that he had decided to persuade his board to do advocacy. I said, great, and he said, so just tell me, how do you pick the issue? What a strange question. So for us at the New York Community Trust, and I think for many of us who do this, there are three legs of the stool. For us, it's direct service, it's research, and it's advocacy and lobbying. And the tool you use at the time is determined a lot by what you support, what you hear from the people you're supporting, and then what's the next tool you need to apply. So I'll use immigration in my city as a great example. We are one of the largest funders of immigrant issues, immigrant legal services, and what we determined 10 years ago was we can't be speaking for those folks. What we have to do is find those community-based organizations that represent our immigrant community and build them. And we've spent 10 years building them into strong support service deliverers for their community. They advocate. They now have a city and statewide organization that gives them voice. That's probably the most productive way we can be helpful, although I would say from time to time adding our voice has made a difference, and we will do that.
Thanks. Great. I think that's a fantastic segue to, I think, our final comment. So maybe if you could hold that question in mind as you answer this question as well. What piece of advice would each of you have to somebody who is maybe at the base of the trailhead, starting their efforts? And if there's a part of this that's about the board, that's great. And then Ellie, we can end with you. And you can maybe say what you see in those two data points, and then what's next for this study. So Carmen, do you want to start us off with the last statement? Piece of advice for somebody starting this work out?
The gift for me of being on the Marguerite Casey Foundation board is that our board represents sectors, represents the places that we do work. I feel like our board is the future of this country, both in substance and in style. And so I feel if there is room to add new voices, new perspective onto boards, I would encourage that. I feel like that is an important barometer for the type of change we want to see.
Thank you.
Great. And, yeah, I would say it's not just the board. So 71% of CEOs said that they had knowledge. That's still low, and that's a self-report. I bet you if you were to quiz them on what they actually know, we might be, well, maybe we wouldn't be surprised. So for me, the bedrock is we have to be informed. We have to understand which tools are available to deploy, how to deploy them, and how to steer clear of any legal peril. And there are groups out there that are going to help. And as we've talked about, legal counsel might take a more conservative posture, but Alliance for Justice is an incredible resource, and their Boulder Advocacy Program is incredible. You can download their report. Nonprofit Vote has a foundation toolkit that shows how you can engage in the voting arena in a nonpartisan way. There are funder affinity groups that you can join, and I know there are representatives here from PACE, the Philanthropy for Active Civic Engagement here, and Kristen, their director, is here. And Funders Committee for Civic Participation is also a good place to plunge in. So bring yourself up to speed. If advocacy is a pathway to help you achieve your strategic mission, embrace it, and don't unnecessarily limit yourself because you're overly cautious. Be bold.
Thank you.
Okay, I would agree. I too noticed that gap and thought it's concerning. Both how many of us executive directors don't know as much as we could or should, and how many haven't engaged their boards. I think if we're not on the same page, we're not going to get a lot of forward movement on this. I think the frustration question is whether it's $85 billion in donor advised funds or whether it's $400 or $500 billion in private foundations. I think the frustration is the same. There are urgent issues, and why aren't more of us doing more about it? I think you kind of answer that question first for yourself. I would say that our donor advised fund business actually isn't growing. It's, we're sort of asking donors who agree with the kind of work we're doing to join us, and those that are more transactional or looking for convenience can go to Fidelity and Vanguard. They do a perfectly good job, in my opinion. I think they were wrong-headed by the IRS. I don't think they should have gotten a tax exemption. I think donors ought to be connected to their communities and those issues. But I think the urgency question is not a new one, and the frustration, I think, is if you regulated donor advised funds, if you made private foundations pay out 15%, whatever issue floats your boat, I think in the end that doesn't change how donors choose to give. Right? So you look at how donors give. They give to eds and meds. They give to high cultural institutions. They don't give necessarily to reduce the income gap. So for those of us in the private foundation world, for those of us in the community foundation world, part of our mission is to try and expand donors' horizons. But you can regulate donor advised funds out of existence. I mean, if you made Fidelity give away whatever billions of dollars it has in donor advised funds tomorrow, it doesn't ensure that that billions of dollars is going to the causes we think need to be changed. So we've got to kind of raise our voices differently and change the debate.
Thank you. Ellie, so what's next?
So, precisely for the point that John raised about how difficult it is to put some of these data pieces together, we decided to pursue a second phase of this research. So that will entail in-depth qualitative conversations with foundation leaders and potentially board members, as well as engaging grantees' voices in the conversation to understand how can foundations better support them in their efforts to do this work. So anyone who's here today or who's watching on live stream, if you have suggestions or ideas for that next phase of research, please do share them with me.
Well, thank you. And obviously, I think there were a few more questions that we couldn't quite get to. There's another session this afternoon in the 2:45 slot about policy and leadership. So please take yourself there and be ready for another really rich and engaging conversation. Please join me in thanking Ellie and Lorie and Paul and Carmen.